Picture an ordinary morning on a small volcanic island in the Aegean Sea, roughly 3,500 years ago. Multi-story buildings line paved streets. Indoor plumbing carries water through clay pipes. Elaborate wall paintings decorate the homes of what was, for its time, one of the most sophisticated urban settlements anywhere on Earth. Vivid frescoes of blue monkeys, swallows, and lily flowers covering entire rooms, evidence of a wealthy, artistically confident community that had no reason to think its way of life was fragile. Nobody living there that morning has any idea they're standing directly on top of a volcano that's about to produce one of the largest eruptions in recorded human history. That town was real. It's called Akrotiri, on the island now known as Santorini, and what happened to it may be the closest thing history has to a real-world Atlantis. Here's what actually happened. Sometime around 1600 BCE, the volcano beneath Santorini erupted with a force. Modern volcanologists rank among the most powerful of the last 10,000 years, assigned a magnitude near the top of the volcanic explosivity index, comparable to, and by some estimates larger than, the 1883 eruption of Krakatoa, which killed tens of thousands of people and altered global climate for years afterward. Ash from the eruption has been found in ice cores in Greenland and sediment layers as far away as the Black Sea and the Nile Delta, physical proof of just how far the debris cloud actually traveled. Unlike Pompeii, centuries later, archaeologists excavating Akrotiri have found no human remains at all, and clear signs of an earlier evacuation, cracked walls being repaired, valuables missing from where you'd expect to find them, suggesting the town's residents fled after smaller warning tremors before the volcano's final, catastrophic phase buried the entire settlement under meters of ash and pumice. The eruption devastated far more than one town. The resulting tsunami likely slammed into the northern coast of nearby Crete, home to the Minoan civilization, one of the Mediterranean's most advanced Bronze Age societies, known for elaborate palaces, extensive trade networks, and a culture that appears to have genuinely revered bulls, based on the sheer number of bull-related frescoes, sculptures, and ritual objects archaeologists have recovered. The palace complex at Knossos alone covered several acres, with multi-story construction, sophisticated drainage systems, and storage facilities capable of holding enormous quantities of oil and grain, evidence of a genuinely complex, bureaucratic society centuries before most of the ancient world reached the same level of organization. Trade routes that depended on Minoan ports were disrupted. Within a few generations, Minoan civilization entered a decline that eventually left room for a rising rival power on the Greek mainland, the Mycenaeans, to take over as the region's dominant culture. Now here's where the story crosses into myth. More than 1,000 years later, the Greek philosopher Plato wrote of a magnificent island civilization called Atlantis, advanced, wealthy, built around a city with concentric circular harbors, its people practicing elaborate bull-related rituals, all of it destroyed in a single catastrophic day and night by earthquakes and flooding. Plato claimed the story originated with Egyptian priests, passed down centuries earlier to the Athenian statesman Solon, who supposedly brought it back to Greece after his own travels. Egypt sat close enough to the Aegean and endured long enough as a continuous civilization that a garbled memory of Bronze Age catastrophe passing through Egyptian records before eventually reaching Plato isn't an implausible chain of transmission, even if none of the intermediate steps have ever been independently confirmed. The specific details, the bulls, the circular harbor design echoing Santorini's crater-shaped caldera, a great civilization erased almost overnight by the sea, line up with the Thera eruption and Minoan collapse closely enough that many historians think Plato's Atlantis may be a distorted, centuries-old folk memory of a real Bronze Age catastrophe, reshaped into a philosophical parable. Plato even describes Atlantis as technologically and militarily superior to Athens, powerful enough that its sudden destruction reads less like random bad luck and more like a warning about what happens when even the greatest civilizations grow too confident in their own permanence. It's not a perfect match, and it's worth being honest about that. Plato places Atlantis beyond the Pillars of Hercules, out in the Atlantic Ocean, and dates its destruction to roughly 9,000 years before his own time. Both details wildly inconsistent with an eruption in the Aegean Sea a mere 12 centuries before Plato wrote about it. Most historians believe Plato took a real, dimly remembered catastrophe and reshaped it into something bigger and more distant, using it as a cautionary tale about a proud, powerful civilization brought low by its own hubris, a message aimed squarely at his own Athens, not a literal historical record. So that's what happened. Now, otherwise. Picture that same volcanic island, except this time, the eruption never reaches that catastrophic final phase. Maybe the magma chamber vents pressure gradually instead of catastrophically. Maybe the specific geological conditions that produced one of the ancient world's largest eruptions simply don't align. Akrotiri keeps growing instead of disappearing under ash, and Minoan civilization never absorbs the trade disruption and tsunami damage that, in our actual history, likely accelerated its decline. Follow that forward, and the balance of power across the entire Aegean world shifts. A Minoan civilization that keeps its trade networks, its ports, and its cultural dominance intact for another century or two doesn't necessarily hand the region over to the rising Mycenaean Greeks on the same timeline our actual history followed. Some historians studying this exact question argue Minoan cultural influence might have continued shaping the broader Greek world for longer, potentially delaying, blending with, or fundamentally altering the specific mainland Greek culture that eventually produced Homer, classical Athens, and the philosophical tradition Plato himself belonged to centuries later. Consider how much of what we think of as ancient Greece actually depends on the Mycenaeans filling exactly the power vacuum they did when they did. Mycenaean warrior culture, later mythologized in stories like the Iliad, absorbed and reworked Minoan art, religious practices, and administrative systems once Crete's influence faded, blending them with its own more militaristic traditions. A Minoan civilization still standing at full strength might have kept the broader Aegean world oriented around trade, maritime commerce, and the kind of palace bureaucracy Crete specialized in, rather than the warrior aristocracy model Mycenaean Greece eventually built its identity around, an identity that fed directly into the epics, values, and self-image classical Greece inherited centuries later. That last detail matters more than it first appears. If Minoan civilization survives intact and Mycenaean Greece develops differently, the entire cultural lineage feeding into classical Greek philosophy shifts with it. Plato, born generations after a very different history plays out, may never encounter the specific fragments of catastrophe folklore that historians think inspired Atlantis in the first place, because in this otherwise version of history, there's no sudden lost civilization for Bronze Age survivors to remember and pass down at all, which means the most famous lost civilization story in Western history simply never gets written. That's a bigger deal than it sounds like. Atlantis didn't stay confined to one philosophy text. For over 2,000 years, it's been reinterpreted, expanded, and half-believed by everyone from Renaissance scholars to 19th century occultists to modern pseudo-archaeology documentaries, becoming the template nearly every lost advanced civilization theory since is borrowed from, whether the specific claim involves Atlantis itself or some other supposedly forgotten ancient superpower. Think about how much modern popular culture still leans on that exact template. Novels, films, video games, and an entire genre of speculative documentaries continue returning to the same basic shape Plato outlined more than 2,000 years ago. A technologically superior civilization, hidden or destroyed, waiting to be rediscovered. 19th century writer Ignatius Donnelly turned Atlantis into a full pseudo-scientific framework that influenced decades of fringe archaeology. Even serious oceanographic and archaeological expeditions have occasionally been funded, partly on the strength of Atlantis's enduring cultural pull. Remove Plato's original text from history, and that entire genre of speculation may never have had a founding story to organize itself around, or might have latched onto some entirely different myth to fill the same cultural need instead. There's a strange echo here, worth connecting to a bigger pattern. Just like the flood myths that appear across dozens of unconnected ancient cultures, Atlantis may be another case of a real, regional catastrophe, surviving in distorted form long after the people who lived through it were gone. But where flood myths seem to have emerged independently, again and again, across cultures that never met each other, Atlantis took a narrower, more specific path. One real disaster, filtered through 1,000 years of retelling, captured by one philosopher, for one very deliberate purpose, and then set loose to be believed far more literally than he probably ever intended. That distinction matters for how we should think about myths in general. Some legends, like the flood stories, seem to bubble up naturally from shared human experience, discovered separately by people who never compared notes. Others, like Atlantis, seem to survive because one specific, talented storyteller happened to pick up a fading regional memory and give it a shape compelling enough to outlast the civilization it was actually describing by well over 2,000 years. Both paths end with a myth people still argue about today. They just get there in completely different ways. One through repetition across an entire species, the other through a single author's decision to reach for a true story and turn it into a warning. If a single natural disaster, retold and reshaped over 1,000 years, could end up inspiring one of history's most enduring myths about a lost golden age, it raises a pointed question worth sitting with. How many other legendary, advanced ancient civilizations that captivate people today might be nothing more than the same kind of distant, half-remembered echo of an ordinary Bronze Age town that simply had the misfortune of being built on top of a volcano? That's exactly where we're headed next time on Otherwise, into the lost cities that might never have been lost at all. Subscribe and find out what's really buried under the ash.